Good afternoon, everyone. If you're on the West Coast, it is still morning, so good day to everyone. Thank you for joining us for Generative AI. You know better than to trust a strange robot. We have our expert instructor from Fathom Cyber, Jim Goepel, is the CEO and General Counsel at Fathom Cyber, so we're grateful to have him here today. We are grateful to have you all here today joining us over the next 90 minutes where he will be instructing us. If you have any questions for Jim, please ask that in the question section. We can address those for you throughout the training. If you have any questions for me, me being Josh, I will be the program manager handling some of the background stuff during this training. Please ask that in the question section, or you can email me at joshpina@publiccontractinstitute.com. If you haven't had a chance to download the materials already, in the materials tab, you can download a PDF version of the slide deck. Most of that information is available in the chat. You'll see my email, the topic, the time frame, all there. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Again, we will have some passwords throughout today's session. Write those down. That will help you receive credit for attending this training. Without further ado, Jim, it is all yours.
Thanks, Josh. As Josh said, I'm Jim Goepel. I'm the CEO and General Counsel of a company called Fathom Cyber. We are a CMMC and cybersecurity consulting company. I have done legal, IT, and cyber work for decades at this point. I've done all sorts of funky things in my career. This is a topic that was really very interesting to me. I am a big fan of the idea of automation. In fact, one of the things that I want are self-driving cars. I want really good, safe self-driving cars. I think they're going to make the world a better, safer place as long as we can secure them properly so that they're not hacked and people don't take control of them and cause all sorts of issues. But assuming we can overcome that hurdle, I'm looking forward to self-driving cars. I really love the idea of being able to just get in. I live outside of the Philadelphia area. Love the idea of being able to get in my car, push a button, and say, okay, take me to my son who goes to George Mason University in Virginia, or to my appointment in DC, and be able to take a nap or get some work done on the car or whatever it is that I want to do, and not have to worry about how to get there. Have these fully autonomous pods that take me places. I really love that idea. And there's lots of other really cool applications for AI. So I am a big fan of this conceptually. And when ChatGPT burst on the scenes a couple years ago, 2 years ago now, I was really excited. I thought, oh, this could be very cool. I'm very curious to see how I can use it in my day-to-day life. And unfortunately, I found that it fell short for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about today. We'll also talk about some of the reasons, some of the legal issues that go around the use of AI in the workplace specifically. But we'll also talk about some other ways that it can actually be really beneficial for you. Josh and I were just talking about it offline because he's actually studying some of the stuff. So he's got some more practical hands-on, and I have invited Josh to unmute himself. I'm going to put him on the spot, but I've invited him to unmute himself at different points if he wants to weigh in, because he's again got a practitioner's view of this too. So it would be great to have him talk about some of these things. But anyway, so what we're going to talk about today, we'll put the bottom line up front, is make sure you review if you're in the legal profession or legal adjacent. So if you're in that contracts role or some of the other support roles, I think it's really smart to review the recommendations from the MIT Task Force on Responsible Use of Generative AI for the Law. It is the basis for a lot of other things that have happened. So that MIT report came out, I think it's about 2 years ago now, and it has been the basis for a lot of the ethics opinions and other things that have come out in different states, and we'll touch on a couple of those ethics opinions, specifically Virginia's and the ABA's. Another thing is make sure you're developing an AI policy for your company. That AI policy needs to address the relevant topics that are outlined in these slides and any others that you become aware of, obviously. And make sure that that policy is actually followed by your entire organization and your service providers. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the upcoming slides. But fundamentally, right, if you have a policy but nobody's paying attention to it, that's going to be a problem. And we'll talk again in later slides about how, from a workforce perspective, your employees are probably going to be wanting to use and will use some of these tools. And so rather than saying, heck no, no way, don't ever use any of the generative AI, finding ways to use it responsibly can be very beneficial. And actually having teams that put together a good well-written policy that is actually crafted not just from the legal perspective or just from engineering's perspective or how whatever your organization looks like, but actually you have a cross-functional group that helps really craft a cohesive policy, you're more likely to get buy-in from your organization. You're more likely to get buy-in from your employees, and you're less likely to have any major systemic issues. You may have rogue employees doing something stupid. There's not much that you can do at the end of the day to prevent that, but the more you can do to create those policies and put those guardrails in place while still giving them capabilities that they need, that would be really beneficial, and that helps limit the likelihood of them wanting to go outside and play with other things. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what AI is, and because I am a big fan. I'm a professor. I do all sorts of, again, funky things. I am a big fan of understanding the why. Why are we doing these things? Because if you don't understand the why, the what am I supposed to do? Without context, it's really hard to interpret. The minute that you run into anything, any issues, it's really hard to understand what you're actually supposed to do. So I think it's really beneficial to understand the why. So uh, what is machine learning? Machine learning is a way of basically using a bunch of algorithms, a bunch of fancy math to identify patterns in source information, what they call training data. That information is then categorized, and the machine actually, as Josh and I were talking about before we started this, the way those new algorithms are written, they are actually like your brain. They are designed to actually mimic the functions of the brain, and so it can actually learn new things. So unlike traditional algorithms that are static and they just follow the same course of action all the time, these things actually can learn and adapt over time, which is really cool. So it can categorize that new information based on patterns that it sees, and it can start to again adapt the way that it thinks and the way those categories are maintained on the fly, where it used to be somebody like me would have to do the data analysis and run the pattern matching and all that kind of stuff, and then you'd have to have it flag outliers, and somebody would have to sit there and do all these crazy things. Now again, all that stuff can be automated, and it's really cool. So machine learning is a great tool in a data analysis, data scientist's toolkit. Then we get to these things called large language models. So the machine learning has kind of grown up into these large language models. What LLMs do is they take data sets not of hundreds or thousands of pieces of information, but billions and hundreds of billions of pieces of information, basically internet scale data sets. So we're going out and we're scouring the internet, grabbing all sorts of components of language, whether those are articles on a particular topic or news articles or some other information that's out there on whatever topic is of interest, or even no topic of interest. It's just generally doing a giant like vacuum cleaner and sucking all that information in and learning from it. That's what we're talking about with a large language model. They do what's called unsupervised learning. That is, they just basically are set free and they can do whatever they want, and they learn whatever is relevant, and especially whatever is tangential to, or touches on the stuff that they're learning at that time. If you've ever been watched YouTube videos or anything like that, you know what it's like, how you go down those rabbit holes of, well, I'm just going to watch this one, and then there's something else. There's that ad that looks interesting, so you click on the next video and you keep going. That's kind of the way these things learn. Is there's some related piece of information, and they just keep going and going until you tell them to stop. So that unsupervised learning allows them to build these statistical models that actually have figured out contextually the way languages are put together. So not only are they learning in English, but they're learning in French and Spanish and German and in other idiomatic languages as well, things like Chinese and Japanese and other languages. Learning how those things are structured, and they're learning how the communications happen in a way that is basically, again, mimics what we do from birth and the way that we're learning to string together words. They look at the way those relationships, how those words all piece together. They look for, again, relationships between those words and the sequencing of them, and figure out how to produce coherent and cohesive language. We take that now and we extrapolate out one more level to generative AI. So not only are we So we'll talk about what generative AI is. It's a new form of machine learning that leverages large language models. It classifies new inputs and actually generates entirely new content. So unlike the LLMs and the machine learning approaches where you would train it on some information and then you would ask it information about that, and it would tell you whether if you trained it on a bunch of images of cats and dogs, you could hold up a picture of something and it would tell you whether it was a cat or a dog. And there's all sorts of other really cool uses for those for some of the basic training models. But for with generative AI, I can now say, "Hey, give me a picture of a cat, give me a picture of a dog," and it needs these attributes, and it will understand because it understands the relationship of the language. It understands the natural language, the way that I would speak. It can actually understand what those mean, how to deconstruct that into a context that it can then turn around and use to generate some new thing for you. And so generative AI can be used for a lot of different things. It can be used to classify information, just like we've talked about with machine learning. That shouldn't come as a surprise. One of the cool things, one of my favorite use cases for AI, and I've already kind of hinted at the fact that I am not a big fan of AI, at least not yet, for certain, especially in certain realms. But one of the areas that I do think it's really useful for is that translation piece. So being able to go from English to Spanish or whatever, or to clean up writing, it's really good at that. Now, there are issues with when you submit information to certain LLMs and certain generative AIs and having them do that manipulation, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But fundamentally, the basic idea of having it do translations, I think it's excellent at those. Actually, better than I don't speak. I speak a couple languages in passing, a few words here and there. The its ability to do those translations are much better than anything that I could even come close to doing using something like Google Translate or the more traditional approaches to doing those translations. Summarizations, it's pretty good at that. I find that it tends to miss a couple critical things, but overall, the summaries are usually pretty good. It can also, again, generate information. So all of those first things, the classification, again, isn't really generation, but translation, now we are taking something that, again, from a contextual perspective, understanding what you're saying and how to translate into a different social set of social norms, different everything. If you speak multiple languages, you know how hard that can be sometimes. The fact that it can understand all of that stuff can make it really beneficial. Now we're getting into the generation idea. Same thing with the summaries, right? You're again generating summaries. And here we are also talking about actually generating net new information. So not just information that's based on something else, but really we can generate all new audio tracks, images. I've had videos made for me. There's all sorts of things that AI can do. It's really cool. And it can even talk back and forth with you. And Josh and I were talking about before about a use case that I've found where this is actually really good for when you're interacting with the generative AI. Depending on what you've had it learn and the specifically what you've trained it on, its ability to generate contextual and valid information for you. If you trained it properly, it's actually pretty cool and it can do some neat things. And it has the ability to take what are otherwise potentially complex documents and or complex ideas and communicate them down to people at scale in a way that right now is very challenging for many companies to do. So as an example of what AI can do, I gave it a prompt of create a standard non-disclosure agreement written in plain English. And it actually did a pretty good job. It came up with something that I'm a lawyer. I read and write NDAs pretty regularly. The NDA that it gave me seemed like it checked at first glance as I went through it. It seemed like it checked most of the right boxes. There were a few things that I would have, as a subject matter expert, I would have made some changes here and there. But overall, as a first swing at something, and quite frankly, for most small and medium businesses today, if they went and asked ChatGPT or pick your favorite LLM or Gen AI tool for an NDA, would it spit out something that would probably be sufficient for them? Yeah, probably. So I actually thought it was really cool that we were able to get that out of it with minimal interaction. there's this whole new set of processes called prompt engineering, where you're writing the prompts and getting generative AI to give you the thing that you want. I'm not sure at the end of the day that there's the efficiency is quite there yet, because you'll spend as much time or more time writing those prompts and tweaking things than if you just tried to create something yourself, and you have to develop a whole new set of subject matter skills to become that expert in the prompt engineering piece. So again, I'm a little skeptical overall in the use of AI, but generally speaking, for high level cursory things like an NDA or like some of the drawings that you've seen, for example, the one on this slide, that picture was actually drawn by generative AI, and there's more in here. In fact, the picture that was on the opening slide, I won't go all the way back there, but the picture that was on the opening slide was also generated by generative AI. So there's lots of really cool things that AI can do. And again, for the less important things like a picture in a slide deck, it can be really cool. Now, there's some issues that go along with it. We'll talk about potential copyright issues and other things in a little bit. Looking at that MIT task force, their report on responsible use of generative AI, they had 7 basic principles that they think law firms should and lawyers should adopt. There's the link for that is at the bottom of the page. There's the biggest thing is the duty of confidentiality to the client in all uses of AI. And this is a really big problem, especially if you are using something like the public versions of ChatGPT and Claude and some of the others, because those tools are actually designed to learn. And so the problem was that when ChatGPT burst on the scene with GPT, I think it was 3.0, came on the scene, it had been trained with information from the internet up through 2021. And so I told it to, for example, go write a bio for me, because I was teaching a course like this, and I wanted something that was in like paragraph form. So I said, generate a bio for me. And it actually did an okay job, because it left off some things that were more recent, but I knew that it had ended in 2021 and I had made some career changes in the intervening time. So I didn't expect it to have those issues. But as you start using this, the way that they overcame the problem of having learned from years and years of information, and how do you bridge that gap to now, is you start actually doing things dynamically. As people interact with the LLM, you start building up additional knowledge in the thing. So you actually start training it from the inputs that people are giving it, as well as if it's doing search results, if it's doing other interactions with the internet, it can learn from all of those things and continue to refine its capabilities, which is really cool and kind of smart from the programmer's perspective. From a user's perspective, though, if I'm putting into that public facing LLM some private information, and there have been cases, for example, where someone was interviewing for a job with Amazon.com, and they said, okay, I give me some sample interview questions that I might expect during an Amazon.com interview. And it gave the set of questions that somebody from Amazon uses as sort of the initial, like the first HR type interview. Those kind of questions that they would ask somebody for that role were actually in there, because somebody from Amazon had gone in and asked it to clean up some of the language or summarize, or what kind of responses should be expected in this particular career. And so there was this sort of innocent use of AI, but it put that information, what was sensitive proprietary information, now into the public facing side of the LLM. And that became up for grabs, and other people were able to get to it. And we've seen over and over again where people have put source code into ChatGPT. And so now that source code was publicly available. There were passwords, there were other information that were extractable from ChatGPT. You could actually get people's names, addresses, and social security numbers at first from it as well, because it just had people had put that information in there. And I keep referencing ChatGPT, and I will continue to reference them, but please understand, I don't just mean ChatGPT. These are issues that are systemic with any of the large language models and the generative AI tools. that are public facing. So again, if you go to ChatGPT, if you go to Claude, etc., these are issues that are again are just kind of built in and fundamental to the way they work, and it's there on purpose, not from a malicious perspective. It again makes sense. You want the thing to continually learn, so the capabilities are there, but boy, there are some significant negative impacts if you don't, from a corporate perspective, if you're not putting the reins on your employees. There's lots of ways that your information can get out there. And from a legal perspective, now that duty of confidentiality, if you're going to put your client's sensitive information, let's say you've drafted some brief, and before you submit it to the court or before you send it to the client for review, you run it through ChatGPT just to double check your grammar and double check your citations. And now you've put it in there and it's available. And I was an expert witness on a case recently that involved it was a healthcare cybersecurity case about somebody who contracted an STD, and now that person, if I had used the tool in that way, that person's name, the information about them, all of that would have been there, and it would have been easily retrievable from that type of that search engine. So I know better than to put it in there, but there are a lot of people who don't. And so this was one of the fundamental things that MIT was worried about was, we need to encourage lawyers to be thoughtful and watch that duty of confidentiality as they're using these AI applications. The fiduciary care, same idea, right? You're getting sensitive information, making sure that you are not doing things that violate that fiduciary care rule. Client notice and consent to the client on all usage of AI applications. This got very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit later about what the ABA said and what Virginia says, because they're at odds with each other, which I found very interesting. When it comes to notice and consent and the use, and specifically around billing of when you're using those AI tools, you do need to let the client know that you're using them and how you use them. So again, you need to have that AI policy, and you need to have an AI policy that you can share with your clients so they understand what you do and what you don't do. And then they can make intelligent choices or informed decisions as to whether they want to hire you if you're going to use their information in a certain way. And now you have gotten at least implied consent that it's okay to put their information or use their information in the way that you've laid out. That helps from a CYA perspective. So making sure that you have all that in place is a good idea. Competence in the use of and understanding of AI applications. So again, there is this whole idea of prompt engineering. If you're going to use AI, you really should be using AI properly. You need to understand what its limitations are, which hopefully this class will help with. But you need to understand some of its limitations, some of the issues that go along with using it, as well as how to go about actually using it. The fiduciary loyalty to the client, again, making sure that you are not misusing that AI in different ways. Regulatory compliance with respect to the rights of third parties, applicable to the use of AI applications in your jurisdictions. So again, we're thinking about things like patents, trademarks, copyrights. If you're being asked to do certain things, like for example, a trademark clearance for a new name for a new product that a client wants to come up with, using AI for that, especially something like one of the public ChatGPT type engines, really probably not the best idea, because again, now you're helping to shape it. Somebody else could go in and get that information, and in the time that it takes your client to finally get the results, review, analyze the results, and file that trademark application, you may see somebody else in there, especially if it's what's called an intent to use. That intent to use application, somebody else may beat them to the punch with a different intent to use application. Right, sorry. And then the duty of accountability and supervision to maintain human oversight over all usage and outputs. So again, you're not going to just use the output from a generative AI tool and give it to the client. You're at least going to review it first, and hopefully with a jaundiced eye, as we'll talk about. And you'll notice the asterisk on number 3, the notice and consent. The consent may not always be required. You'll need to look at the guidance. However, I strongly suggest that it is a smart thing to put the get notice and consent from your clients for the reason we talked about.
Hey, Jim.
Go ahead.
Do you mind if we do the first password now?
No, go right ahead. That's a good time.
The first password is the word large, capital LARGE. Large is the first password. Hopefully that doesn't cue you off into anything. But our first password for today is large. And kind of just to briefly, what Jim just mentioned at the end of that last slide is pretty much one of the biggest topics that we've touched on in ethics and data science is that you want to use these tools, some of which Jim hates, which is understandable, that you want to use it as a tool, not as the thing guiding you. It's just an additional tool in the toolbox.
The way I've described it to people is you want to make sure that you're augmenting humans, not replacing humans. Oh, then it looks like we may have lost Josh. So hopefully we didn't. But
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
yeah, the big thing again, I think to Josh's point was you'll want to make sure that you're thinking about how to augment the work that your team is doing, not trying to replace them. So they are not good from a subject matter expert perspective. They are not going to replace attorneys. They're not going to replace whatever it is. They're not going to replace them yet. But for some of the high level stuff, and again, especially to augment your capabilities, I think they're very smart, and there are good ways to use them. So let's talk a little bit about potential bias, and this is one of the reasons that you want to be very careful and very thoughtful about the use of AI. Is all machine language and machine learning depends on fundamentally on that training information, and the bias can wind up creeping in from a lot of different places. So fundamentally, if you are only training it on, go from a political perspective, if you're only training it on websites that focus on conservative talk or on progressive talk, you're going to inherently have bias in things. So even from a news reporting perspective, if you kind of go center and left or center and right, you're still going to have a lot of fundamental issues and fundamental bias in there. So trying to make sure that you're selecting a fair balance of information, and it's not just from a political perspective. There's lots of other source selection issues. There were, as you can see on the screen, the racial discrimination case in face recognition. There were studies that were done that showed that most of the software developers, so a lot of this AI and ML machine learning stuff comes out of the United States. The United States is a majority white population, and especially when you get into the cybersecurity and information, the computer programming fields, they are predominantly white and predominantly white male. That's changing, which is wonderful, but right now that's kind of who is in there. And when you're teaching these computer programs how to do things, what do? Well, you go get your own pictures because you don't want to just grab anybody's. And so at first you're going to do training on you and on the people that you work with and all of that kind of stuff. And so what happened was the training model. So that when we go back to that bias and selected source content, the early facial recognition tools were trained on white male faces, and so no surprise, they did a wonderful job of picking out white male faces. They had like a 99.5 99.9% accuracy rating. Even people who, like twins, it could find, and what most of us would call identical twins, it would find those subtle variations and be able to tell the difference between them. Really cool. And then the AI tools got rolled out in the real world, and guess what? There are lots of other people out there than just white males. So they had trouble identifying, especially people with dark skin, because the lighting, it tended to use ambient lighting instead of using infrared. And so it looked at things from a certain perspective, and it had learned from typical photographs rather than having somebody go through enrollments. And there's all sorts of things that were fundamental issues that made it harder the for those tools to be able to identify people of color. So now you just have these fundamental issues that sometimes it's purely mechanical, purely systemic, but not intentional, just systemic issues that arise. And again, you have this unintentional bias and hidden bias that is there, that until these things get out in the real world and they start getting used, that's when you finally realize that there's an issue. Same thing happened with ChatGPT. There were there were studies that showed that ChatGPT had a political bias. I think they've tried to temper that some, but there were a lot more, again, to go on the political side, there were a lot more training tools that were skewing left leaning than right leaning. And so ChatGPT would tend to give you more progressive views. So it's very interesting, especially in the when you're working with those public data sets. You have issues with, again, fundamentally who picked what was used to train that AI. And AI can also obviously then amplify existing biases. So if you are left leaning and you tend to put something in that talks about left politics, it's going to come back with a left leaning or right leaning. It doesn't matter which way. It's fundamentally, it's going to tend to give you. Josh and I were talking about earlier. The AI tools tend to want to satisfy you. They want to make you happy, which sounds really odd from a computer software perspective. But if it won't tell you I don't know. It will always try to find some answer for you. And so again, if your answer skews in one direction, it's kind of going to look in that direction too and not in the other direction. So again, amplifying your bias. It can, though, AI can be used to detect bias when it's properly trained too. And so one of the cool tools that people have been doing is to go back and retrain. Once you know what bias looks like, you can start to then identify where it exists and start to retrain those models to temper out some of that bias. But again, it's got to be trained properly, and you have to realize that there is bias to begin with in order to be able to do this, and that adds a whole extra layer of complexity. And now, again, we're still in the early phases. The chat GPT is 2 years old. So we're still in the early phases of the use of a lot of these models. And from a societal perspective, we're still dealing with these things. From a practical perspective, as a lawyer, we're still trying to figure out how to make all this stuff fit in with our companies and understanding big picture that these issues exist. So, how do you identify and address those biases? The first and fundamental thing that you can do is to educate your employees. Make sure that they understand that these tools are not perfect. They are good at generalities, but they are definitely not perfect. Ensure diverse teams and training data are involved wherever possible. So, we'll talk a little bit later about creating your own training models, and it can be done, and it actually can be done relatively inexpensively. There are things that are run. You'll read if you follow this stuff in the news, you'll hear how like ChatGPT, it costs, I think they said something like $100 million a year just for ChatGPT to respond to please and thank you. So they're encouraging you to not do that. Which, if you're a fan of sci-fi, we're just waiting for Skynet, and so being nice to the AI models now might establish us as being good citizens later. But fundamentally, if you're using these external systems, that's one thing. But if you have the ability to actually generate them, and you can actually run them on a local laptop, and train them on a much smaller data set and be able to give you more personalized and or contextualized information, which is great. If you're going to do that, make sure that you're bringing not just one or two people in, but actually a whole team of people from your organization. Make sure that you're really getting good cross section data from it so that it trains appropriately. You're going to process that training data to identify and remove bias where you can. Again, there are now tools that help you with that process, which is really cool. And then you'll solicit feedback from users and ideally experts to identify that potential bias. The reason that this is such an issue is not only does bias creep in from inputs that people are creating, so at the questions that they ask of ChatGPT or pick your favorite tool, but also it impacts the accuracy of the answers that they get. So you can see on the screen, ChatGPT went from answering a relatively basic math problem about whether certain numbers were prime numbers or not. It went from answering that correctly 98% of the time to only 2% of the time, because people would intentionally get in there and actually poison the information that was in ChatGPT. So they would intentionally inject misinformation into the tool, and since the tool is designed to learn from the inputs, there's kind of this assumption that what people are saying is true, or at least over time, if it hears it enough times, it starts to influence its ability and its answers. So you'll want to make sure that you're using a tool where the accuracy of that information is validated in some way. Again, the inputs to it can degrade the accuracy over time, and so sometimes retraining, refreshing its training set, and resetting it back to, again, a controlled set of inputs can be beneficial. So what does that look like? Well, some silly examples are things like the ones that you see online all the time. There are places where you'll see pictures with quotes on them, or pictures of people. The one that you can kind of see down in the bottom over here, if I can get my laser pointer going, the one back here is says "Born on this day, 1969, Friends actress Jennifer Aniston." That is not a picture of Jennifer Aniston. Same thing with Keith Richards holding a picture of baby Jesus. All of these, right? They're just fundamentally things that aren't real. But if these are fed into a large language model, and especially something that was doing unsupervised learning, well, it sure looks like George Washington said something about you should always have a healthy skepticism of everything you read on the internet, especially quotations. How does it know the difference, right? So there are fundamental things that, again, if unless you are training on, and you are smart enough as you're creating your bias detection and your accuracy detection models to identify who George Washington is, when he was born, all that kind of stuff, to know that he was way before the internet and that this quote would not be right. Fundamentally, the LLM is going to learn from it, and it's going to think that it's reasonable. So, as an example, generative AI is good at creating linguistically accurate content that is also contextually relevant. Generative AI is not good at ensuring that its content is contextually accurate. So, there is a fundamental distinction there. The way the embodiment of this is, in a previous job, worked with some folks who hated our non-disclosure agreement because it read too much like a lawyer wrote it, which, big surprise, because I wrote it. So it read too much like a lawyer wrote it. They wanted it rewritten. That's why that give me a non-disclosure agreement written in plain English. That was where I was coming from with that, and that was interesting. And then I knew some of the people in my organization well enough to know that if we could come up with something that was clever, especially easily, they would really like that. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a standard non-disclosure agreement written in rhyme, and you'll see on the left hand side is part of the rhyming non-disclosure agreement. um, and it's okay. I mean, it's amusing to read, and at a high level it kind of checks a couple basic boxes for a non-disclosure agreement. But from a legal perspective, does it actually meet the basic requirements that you would explore, check the right boxes for being a non-disclosure agreement? No, I would not feel comfortable putting this in front of somebody and asking them to sign it. There were fundamental things that were missing, and I am good at a lot of things, but writing poetry and rhyme is not one of them. So going in and trying to edit this to make it a better document was really not something that I could do. So I thankfully abandoned this approach. But this is what I mean by contextually relevant, right? It understood what the goal was of what I was trying to write, that is a non-disclosure agreement, and the language that it created all met that basic requirement of it. It sort of was in the right vein of a non-disclosure agreement, but it understood the rhyming part was the higher priority, and unfortunately we sacrificed accuracy. That is, the language that it gave me just didn't actually meet the bill at the end of the day. And there are ways to address some of those accuracy issues. Now, again, I still wouldn't use ChatGPT to generate a rhyming non-disclosure agreement, even with some of these. But fundamentally, if you review all of the AI generated content with skepticism, and you'll notice actually after a while, ChatGPT and some of the other engines too have started giving you warnings. So things like you can ask questions, but don't share sensitive information, and make sure you check your facts, right? And so they're actually telling you that the AI tools aren't always the most accurate, and that they will actually have what are called hallucinations. They will tell you things that it thinks you want them to tell you, and completely make stuff up. And that's where things start to get a little more interesting. So that's why you want to make sure that you're pretending that whatever it is that you're getting out of the AI tool, make sure that it was pretend that it was generated by opposing counsel. You want to read it with a healthy set of skepticism, and make sure that it actually meets your needs. And you want to make sure that you validate your sources. So there was actually a case in New York, and there have been a couple other cases recently where an attorney used ChatGPT, and it was in this case ChatGPT, to help it write a brief. It asked for cases that were on point for their particular the particular issue that was at issue in their case. ChatGPT completely made up a case, and when the attorney who had been practicing in this field for a long time said, "I've never heard of that," literally paraphrasing, but said, I've never heard of that case before. Is this a legitimate case?" And ChatGPT came back and said, "Yes, it is." And so he said, "Okay," and he filed the brief. The judge read it, said, "I've never heard of this," went to look for it and couldn't find it. And so the guy was sanctioned. There were all sorts of other issues. So you want to make sure that you're really validating the sources that are used. This happened to me. I mentioned before how I asked it to generate a biography for me. And so one of the things, I've written a couple of books, and I it told me that I had written a book that I hadn't written. And so I went off and searched online to see if that book that it had attributed to me, if someone with my name, I have an unusual last name, so if someone with my name had actually written the book, it would have been kind of cool. And so I went off and searched, and my name is nowhere associated with that book. No one with my name is associated with that book either. So I went back to ChatGPT and I said, "Is Jim Goepel the only author on that book, or were there co-authors?" And it said that I was the only author. And then I said, and again, this is completely false. And so then I said, can you give me some book reviews or other articles that were written about the book? Thinking, okay, I'm going to catch it in the lie. And it doubled down, and it actually told me it made up reviews from that were associated with or tied to authoritative sources, actual book review places. It gave me stuff that was attributed to them, but again, it literally had my name in it. It had the name of the book, and it talked about the book in the context that would have been valid in a cybersecurity related context. But again, none of it was true. The literally the book didn't exist. I didn't write it. It did, like, just fundamentally it was an issue. So it does, and it will double down, and it doesn't admit when it's wrong. None of the tools are good at admitting when they're wrong. Even when you challenge them, even if you ask them, they will make up citations. So fundamentally, you want to be very thoughtful. Now, hopefully, these things will be fixed in future generations of the tools. But even more recently, there's stuff I asked for my birthday last year. I wanted to go out to eat. I wanted to find new restaurants because I'm tired of eating at the same places. I wanted to find new restaurants that were reasonably priced, that had good reviews. And I asked it for that. I gave it my address. I gave it my zip code, and it made up 3 of the 4 restaurants that it gave me, and the other restaurant that it gave me was an hour and a half away. So you'll want to make sure you're doing your diligence, make sure that you're actually validating that the information it's giving you is legitimate. For that, you tend to need to be a subject matter expert. So again, that's where that human augmentation, it's great for, but you do need to have that healthy skepticism when you're working with it. Fundamentally, from a workflow perspective, there are ethical and reputational risks that go along with the use of AI as well. So we have the issue of it creating fake news and deep fakes, and also being fed with fake news and deep fakes. So there was a finance worker that was, and there are links. You can get a copy of the slides from PCI. There's a link here to an article from CNN, I think it was about a year ago. A finance worker paid out over $25 million after a video call with a deepfake CFO. So somebody in a foreign country had found videos of the CFO of that company, had trained up the AI engine to on what that person looked like, and then there's lots of videos. If you go search for them, you can see people interviewing for jobs. For example, they happen to be Asian, generally from China. You'll see that they're on the video applying for these jobs, but they will superimpose a different face on theirs, and literally they can move their face around up and down, and the image tracks, and it looks like whoever it is. So in this case, the CFO. This poor finance worker actually got a call from somebody who looked like, and the voice was set up to mimic the sound of that's the CFO. And so they told them that they needed to do something, of course, the stereotypical phishing type attack, right? Where they put a lot of pressure on you. You need to do this and you need to do it now and that kind of stuff. The poor person fell for that right off the bat. And it's understandable why. But there's also these issues of public perception. So not only when you're infringing, so if you're using AI and it generates infringing uh, intellectual property for you, that's obviously fundamentally a problem. But there's also public perceptions. If you're using AI, there have been lots of cases where companies used it behind the scenes. So they would do data analytics and other things and wound up using some of the public facing stuff. And then again, all of that source information is now out in the wild and accessible to the rest of the world. And when people find out about it and there's effectively a data breach because of it, that creates all sorts of public perception issues. So again, that's where telling people what you're going to do with their information, make sure that they understand that you're submitting it to AI and how you're using AI. That's fundamentally really important because again, it can backfire on you in really big ways depending on the kinds of information that you're putting in there. There are also legal ethical issues. We've talked a little bit about that. We'll circle back to that a little bit later as well. Is generative AI an existential threat to humanity? There are some fundamental questions from a societal perspective too. As we get past some of these fundamental issues, how do we as a society deal with this? AI is potentially in a place, ironically, and there's a bunch of memes on this, but ironically, AI is in a place to actually take the place of mid-skilled workers. So the highly skilled folks probably not. And again, ironically, some of the day-to-day things like flipping hamburgers at McDonald's, they're not going to be able to do. AI can't do that, not yet anyway. So we'll have low skilled workers and we'll have really high skilled workers, but the folks in the middle, which is where a good chunk of our tax base comes from, those people are going to go away as AI continues to grow. And what do we do from a societal perspective? And there's all sorts of really interesting implications for along those lines. And then fundamentally, if you're a lawyer and especially if you're outside counsel, what does the use of AI mean when it comes to billing? We'll talk about some of those things in some of the upcoming slides. Another big area that comes up is litigation and e-discovery. So there are risks in the use of AI, especially if you're using some of the like tools that will summarize. We use Microsoft Teams a lot for the last several companies that I've worked for. Microsoft now has this really cool capability where it will take notes and it will transcribe the meeting. But of course, it doesn't always get the language exactly right, and it doesn't always attribute who's speaking properly either, which is kind of odd, but you would think it would be really good at that. But every so often it gets that wrong. And then you have these note taker tools that actually do the same thing. They take those transcripts, but they also go one step further. They record all that information, they bring it out to their LLM. They then analyze all of that information and they will give you back a summary, including all of the work tasks that you need to do and other really cool capabilities so that you can be a more active listener. And it just sits back and takes notes for you, which is, again, conceptually a really cool idea. But what do you do when the employees don't want to be recorded or summarized? Many times these are you have two-party states, so meaning that both sides have to consent to that recording. So what happens when that note taker tool or that other capability is there? We don't really have any good, clear guidance from courts or even from some of the legislatures about whether the use of those by one party is an issue. Obviously, if you're taking your own notes, not really a big deal, but as soon as you have AI and as soon as that AI then takes that information outside of your environment to somewhere else and starts churning with it, and what are they doing with the information? What are they doing with the summaries? That all becomes a fundamental issue as well. So we don't really know how that's going to play out. What do you do when the text was hallucinated? That is, so you may ask an AI engine a question, and like I said, it made up a whole bunch of stuff about me and the books that I've written and all that kind of stuff. What do you do when is that now responsive, or when it is responsive to some kind of e-discovery request, even though the AI tool made this stuff up? What are the implications for me? I'm going to now have to prove the negative, right? I'm going to have to prove that no, it wasn't true. That's a lot of wasted resources potentially. So how do we handle those hallucinations, and how do we train our employees to handle those hallucinations? Can generative AI draw conclusions from your data that create knowledge even if no one saw those conclusions? So there are issues with, from a product liability perspective. For example, if you're running AI and you have it doing things and it generates an alert, but nobody ever reads the alert, nobody ever says, "Oh, there's a problem with the tolerances for something that we're making, and it's going to break it after 25 uses," and it pops up a warning on the screen, or it generates a warning, but nobody actually reads it. Now there is this actually knowledge on the part of your company, and what's the liability look like for your company if, again, you're using these data analytics tools, but people aren't actually following through on the alerts that are generated? And this is an especially big problem when hallucinations are in play, because now basically you've got a bunch of potentially false positive things, and not only do you have your typical false positives, but you have the other kinds of false positives that are literally just made up. And so now your teams are busy chasing down all of these potential issues, and they don't know, like the boy who cried wolf, they don't know the stuff that's legitimate and the stuff that's not. And then can you avoid over retention of information? So how do you keep the AI tools from retaining this information for even longer? And especially if it's going outside of your organization to a third party, there's one that came to mind called Firefly.ai. That tool, if it's going to take all of the transcripts from my conversation and they go out there, what happens to that from an e-discovery perspective? Do I now need to include that in, from a responsiveness perspective? Do I need to go get information from that AI tool? How do I know what its record retention policy looks like? Do they meet our internal policies? There's all these other issues that need to be dealt with when you're using these tools. And then again, where is it stored anyway? Is it actually out in the cloud? Is it somewhere else? And what do we do about the deep fakes? So as we're training all of these things in the way that we look, the way that we speak, the way that we interact with other people, it allows these tools to generate better and better deep fakes. What do we do? Do we continue to use those third party tools? What are the risks that are associated with that? Is that really the direction that we want to go as a company? These are all decisions that need to be made from an eyes wide open perspective. And then we get into some of the confidential information as well. So confidential information, obviously, as we've talked about, your inputs may be used to train or fine tune a model, and the inputs may be deemed public disclosures, although there are some cases that are suggesting that they may not be public disclosures. But fundamentally, I'm a patent attorney by training. If I were to create some new tool and I want to have the AI help augment, help double check it, whatever I'm doing, if I'm disclosing that to that public AI tool, again, is that now a public disclosure? And have I voided my patent rights, especially in foreign countries? The US gives you a 1-year grace period, but have I voided my patent rights in other countries because now I've made a public disclosure? There are lots of cases where, if this was in other contexts, the answer would have been yes, that was a public disclosure, or would likely have been a public disclosure, and we're just not quite sure. There is a case out of California that looks like, or out of Florida, sorry, that looks like there may be something that says that no, it's not a public disclosure, but until we get more definitiveness out of the courts, this is really something you want to be very thoughtful about if you're worried about patent rights. Your inputs again may be hacked, sold, or inadvertently released, because now all of this stuff goes into the training data for these different models. And so if you are not using a private version of these tools, again, it's all out there and potentially usable by others, or disclosable to others. Like other SaaS tools, your employees may retain access after leaving the company. So you'll want to make sure, to the greatest extent possible, that you have the what's called federated access, where everybody logs into your systems, and then when they want to use ChatGPT or they want to use one of the other tools, it just it does all the authentication through you, so that when they are terminated, you just disable their account in your system, and it automatically blocks their account in every other system, so including those AI tools. If not, again, now they've got a username and password. They potentially could log back into those generative AI tools, and in some cases, those AI tools have a history of all of your interactions. So now if they've been using it for, again, intellectual property creation, or if they've been writing something for you, they have the ability to go grab that. Think about source code that was uploaded to make sure that it was written properly and didn't have any bugs in it. All of that kind, or any vulnerabilities in it, that kind of stuff now again is recoverable by them even after they've left. So you'll want to be thinking about how your employees are using these tools. Bottom line, tell your employees not to put confidential information in there, and consider entering into an agreement with a provider that can provide service with access limited to your company. So again, a private version of these capabilities rather than that full public version of everything. And we've talked a lot about the intellectual property pieces of this already, but fundamentally, uh, human authorship is the bedrock of copyright law, and there are several cases right now that have talked about this, basically shooting down the idea that if AI generates something, that it's still protectable as yours. You have to be actively involved in the generation. Where that line is and how much human input is necessary is an interesting problem that the courts are wrestling with and will probably continue to wrestle with for a long time. Because if I, for example, in some of the pictures that you'll see, if I'm really specific in what I want to see, I want a photorealistic image of a blonde woman with blue eyes, sitting at a desk, working on an Apple Macintosh computer with blah 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 all the way down, and it generates that image for me. Now there's a lot of creativity that has gone into that, and my expression, and it's just creating the picture that was in my mind, and making it real, something that I'm a terrible artist, so something that would be wonderful. But on the flip side, if I basically just say, give me a picture of a woman sitting at a desk, is that good enough? And so again, the level of creativity and the level of human interaction starts to become an issue from an authorship perspective. On the inventorship side, it really becomes much more interesting. So if AI generates something for you and actually creates something for you, is that yours? Is that the AI's? Is that the owner of the AI model? You'll want to make sure that you're reading some of the license agreements that go along with the use of these tools, because they may not be granting you, they may be keeping ownership of the things that are generated by it, and you may get a license to use the information, but license to use isn't a license to enforce. And so there are fundamental issues. You don't own it. You can't go get a patent on it. You don't have all the rights to be able to do these things. So again, fundamentally, you'll want to look at very carefully what's happening in your organization and how you're using these things. The Patent Office has published a website with its current guidance. I strongly encourage you, if you are in a field where where intellectual property protection is critical, you'll want to make sure that you are reading through all of that stuff and staying abreast of this. On the flip side, there's also the risk that the AI models will spit out information that is copyrighted or that is licensed and proprietary data. And now, what does that do for you from a risk perspective? And even things like the right of publicity. So it may add an image of someone. My example of a blonde woman sitting at a desk, right? Like that. If that's a picture of someone, especially someone famous that I don't recognize because I don't pay attention to that stuff, it's entirely possible that it could put someone into my picture that I'm using their likeness, and I can create all sorts of issues for myself. And even from a trademark perspective, it could actually inject trademarks into that picture. And so again, if I'm creating a mark, what does that mean? Has it done any kind of trademark clearance on that stuff? There's all sorts of potential issues, and these are not just theoretical. Getty Images had a problem. So Getty Images, their picture, you can see that on the left. That was the input. There was another company that used its inputs and actually generated the picture on the right. Now, and that picture was used in promotional materials. I am not so sure that I would want to use that from a practical perspective. The guy's leg looks like it's in about 6 different pieces, and his face does not look like it really should. But again, as the AI tools get better, those kinds of issues will go away. And fundamentally, again, the fundamental question is, will the transformed image be creative enough to get you out of the potential copyright violations for the stuff that it's generating for you? So again, you'll want to be thinking, going in eyes wide open, understanding the risks, training your employees as they're using this stuff. And Josh, I will pause in just a minute. I want to get through this slide, and then I think we transition to the next topic, and I will pause and let you give the next password in just a second. But again, from a practical perspective, make sure that you are tracking your human involvement and direction when AI is used in that creative process. Make sure you know what the prompts were that were used. If you're going to try, especially if you're going to try to protect that information, you'll want to know just how much human involvement was there. Um, Even on, if your coders are using generative AI to reduce the risk of infringement, double check to make sure the code is not copyrighted or proprietary, which can be really difficult to do. There are tools that can do that for you, but to reduce the risk of AI contamination, there are actually open source tools that will look for and look for open source language or open source code that has been injected into your code. So you'll want to start using those things to find the stuff. If you're going to be doing this on a regular basis, and even download an open source large language model and run it locally. That's kind of the big takeaway from all of this. Make sure you're running that LLM locally and train it on the things that you want. If you're generating AI to create ad copy or marketing materials, be sure to check that imagery and text is not copyrighted and that the claims made are accurate, not false or made up, to reduce the risk of infringement or false advertising claims. That can be really hard to do. You can use Google image search, you can use certain other things to try to find related pictures, but otherwise, and you'll want to document the heck out of your diligence for that. Make sure that you are doing that piece, because that's the stuff that's going to help cover your rear end if someone files some kind of claim. And Josh, now I will actually take a breath and give you a chance to put up that next password.
No problem at all. Our second password is language,
Uh-oh.
capital LANGUAGE. Language is our next password.
It
I'll leave
seems
this
like
up
I may
there.
have lost Josh completely. Hopefully it's
Jim,
not me. Hopefully it's just Josh. Um,
I
so I'm going
believe
to
it.
assume that Josh is out for some reason. I do believe from what I heard in the first password, I'm going to guess that the second password was language, and I will make sure that I tell him that the second word that we used was language. Make sure that you write down that second word, language. Make sure that you keep that somewhere, because you'll need to submit all three words to PCI. Hmm. All right. And Josh I just got a note that said that Josh was responding, so I can't hear him for some reason. Josh, if you'll be kind enough to put back in the chat when you've closed that, I will keep going. I apologize. I don't know what's going on with my audio all of a sudden. Okay. So Josh just said the poll is closed. I apologize. I'm glad that you can at least hear me, because boy, it'd be really bad if I was just talking for like half an hour and nobody could hear me. So, all right, let's look at the privacy impacts here, and we've talked about a lot of these already. There are lots of potential privacy impacts, including things like data privacy and security. Again, you want to make sure that you're not putting a lot of sensitive information up into those systems. They depend on the incorporation of a lot of information, and they will ingest it and potentially make it public. There are also issues with user profiling and data exploitation, so they can analyze user interactions. There's lots of really cool things. There were some early use cases of AI being used for looking at mortgages and whether to lend money to certain people, and letting AI make those decisions. And it sounds like a really smart thing, because there's a lot of it is kind of rote mechanical analyses. But there have been, again, because of bias, because of other issues, there have been a lot of challenges to those cases. And in fact, there's legislation now that has pushed us away from that use case. But that information, again, can be used by others too. So if you're putting that sensitive information into especially public facing AI engines, again, there's the what else is that AI engine doing with that information, and what else are other users of that engine doing with that information? How are they? Can they use it for user profiling, data exploitation, etc.? Um, there's also the idea of accidental data exposure. So again, we've talked about how that information, once it's in there, it may actually get out because you've submitted it and now accessible. And sorry, I'm just trying to summarize because we are running short on time. But there's also the lack of control over that shared information. As soon as you push the information up into that AI engine, now what do you do with it, and how can you control it? How can you get it back? If you're in, especially if you were in the EU, where you have the right to delete your information, if that information is now in a third party, if the user has given you their information, you then give it to an AI engine. Now they want you to delete their information. What do you do? How do you interact with it? How do you get that information deleted from that third party tool? Can you even do that? What about the other copies of it that have gone to potentially other people? There's all sorts of issues that go into that. And then again, those biased and inaccurate responses. There are also other regulatory risks that come into play. So there's a trend from a regulatory perspective toward transparency, explainability, discrimination analyses, etc., throughout the regulations around the world. So there are lots of cases that Facebook and the Department of Justice, for example, settled in 2022 for a housing discrimination algorithm that targeted ads, including lookalike audiences, to target ads based on a current customer base. So there was a lot of bias that went into who got those ads and who was excluded from getting certain ads. That created all sorts of issues. And even on the EU side, there's the Artificial Intelligence Act that is now in place that bans unacceptable risks such as social scoring, biometric identification and categorization of people, some facial and emotional recognition, and even cognitive behavioral manipulation. So the example that they cite is the use of toys that actually encourage children to do potentially dangerous behaviors, which is an interesting scenario. There, it also adds transparency, safety, and human right requirements for high risk AI, and they have a whole definition for what that high risk AI means. And then it requires summaries of copyrighted material used for training models and measures to safeguard against content that violates EU laws. So you'll actually, as a user or as a regulator, you have the ability to see what those models were trained on, so that then you can make sure that it wasn't trained on anything that violates their laws. And again, if you're playing in this space, if you're creating these AI models, you'll need to make sure, especially if you're doing stuff in the EU, you'll need to make sure that you're tracking all of that from a compliance perspective. If you do this in China, it gets even more interesting. So China released measures for labeling artificial intelligence generated content. It takes effect in a couple months. So fundamentally, anytime you're generating AI content, it either needs to be explicit in the AI content or implicit in the metadata for it that says, "Hey, this was generated content." I'm a big fan. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm kind of a big dork. I enjoy the show, the Curse of Oak Island. On it, they use a lot of computer generated images now of historical figures. And down in the corner, and started seeing over the past like 2 years, they start saying computer generated image to make it clear that the old-fashioned looking painting thing isn't actually from some historical place. It was generated by AI. And that's the idea here, right? If we're going to start generating stuff, we need to tell people that, hey, this was generated, it's not real. Creates some interesting issues from a political perspective, especially with China being the one that issues this, but we won't go down that road too much. China also issued some draft rules that require advanced government security review of AI engines and AI tools. The training data must also comply with Chinese laws, and it holds companies accountable for their model's output, so that output can't threaten state or social order or discriminate. And then the US FDA has also created a plan for the use of AI and machine learning software in medical devices. Again, there's some really cool potential capabilities, some cool use cases for it. But if you're playing in the medical device space, you'll want to be very thoughtful because there are, I think in a good way for now at least, there are some regulatory barriers that are being put up to help kind of control the use, because from a life-saving perspective, some of the stuff is, again, could be very cool, could be very beneficial, but there's a lot of times we rush into the positives and we ignore the negatives. For example, there was a case a couple years ago where somebody at Target was really good at data analytics, and he realized that when people exhibit certain buying patterns, or he realized that people exhibit certain buying patterns when they are pregnant, specifically women at a certain age. They start to exhibit very specific things. They buy very specific things. They start looking at certain things. They have longer dwell times on certain things. And so they could detect when people were pregnant, and they could start sending them codes. You could send them coupons and stuff for discounts. And that's actually a really big deal, because it's one of the few times in your life where your brand preferences tend to change, or where you shape your brand preferences. So the more you can push people to Target and to the brands that they carry, the better off Target is going to be. So they wanted to identify this stuff. Really cool. Target does that, and it works really well, except that one day they send a letter to a 16-year-old girl who hadn't told her parents that she was pregnant, but Target detected it and started sending all of these ads to her, and it created all sorts of issues. There was all sorts of discomfort. If you go search for it, you can find it. And those kind of things, you want to be thoughtful about. A lot of times we think about the positive use cases, and we do it for kind of the right reasons, or at least to make money, which is not really a bad reason, but we do it for kind of the right reasons, but we don't stop to think about how the negative sides of how this information and how these tools can be used. So you really want to make sure that you're thinking about that, and that's kind of the core of a lot of the stuff from the FDA's rules. A lot of additional regulations are also likely. Several countries have formed task forces to explore how to regulate AI and generative AI. And again, we've seen the EU already doing that. We've seen China already doing that. The US is starting to look at it. There are other countries as well that are looking at it. And then from an HR and morale perspective, the big picture is it's going to be almost impossible to prohibit the use of AI and LLMs in your organization. In fact, your employees are already probably using them. So the smart thing to do is to get those policies in place now. Your employees are going to be really worried about creativity and autonomy. So there's lots of cool things that can make them even more efficient too. They want to be able to use these tools. I worked in my previous role with a bunch of software developers. They loved what's called Copilot, because Copilot could generate all source code for them. Some of the basic stuff that they would otherwise have to sit there and write, they literally just ask it for it and it would spit it back. And it improved their efficiencies considerably, which was great for us as a company from a productivity perspective. And even for some of the stuff, like I've said in these slides, some of the images that I have were generated by AI. It's great for me from a creativity and autonomy perspective. I don't need to hire somebody to create these pictures. I can get them all generated for me. But on the flip side, your employees are also going to be concerned. So they're going to be worried about job displacement. Specifically, some of these tasks that are performed again by low or mid-skilled employees, some of them are highly repetitive tasks that AI can handle and can do actually as good or a better job than humans. So smart thing is to start thinking about what does that do, and your employees are going to be worried about that. How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to put in place employee training programs? Are you going to actually, again, instead of looking to displace, if you're looking to augment, now your employees have a reason to embrace AI instead of fear it, which might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. There's perceived unfairness if the AI is doing certain things. Changes in work dynamics. So the way that they work, what they do on a day-to-day basis is likely to change as AI becomes more prevalent. So what does that look like for a lot of us, especially as we get older? I don't really want to learn new things, and I don't want to have to change my job. I've gotten really good at doing things the way that I do them, and I can go home at 5 o'clock every evening and I have a nice life and I can settle in. Having to have this huge disruption is not something I'm happy about. So, um, again, you'll want to think about all of those factors as you're trying to figure out what you're doing for your organization. Whether you're going to need to redefine some of those job roles, what does the skills and training look like, and not just for older employees, but for new employees, how do we make sure that they're able to use AI effectively? Again, all things that you'll really want to think about as you're building this stuff out. And then charting a path forward. If I can get my slides to work, there we go. Uh, Again, you'll want to make sure that you're drafting that AI policy. The smart thing that I think I hate, I've worked in organizations that have written stuff by committee, and I will tell you that that is a horrendous way to do things. If you have people in your organization who are comfortable with putting a lot of effort into something just to see it all thrown away, that's actually the better way to do things in general, because most of the time it's not all thrown away. So my recommended approach is write an AI policy, get someone in your organization, appoint them to write that first generation of the policy. It doesn't actually get adopted, though. You'll then establish a steering committee inside the organization to refine the policy. You'll make sure that people on that steering committee are people with diverse backgrounds, including from age, technology competence, job functions, as wide a range of people in your organization as possible. And the reason you want to do that is the more that you can get buy-in from at the grassroots level in your organization, the more likely it is that people will actually follow that policies. And you actually develop champions then inside of your organization who will carry this forward. And that goes a long way toward ensuring that those policies are actually followed. The other piece that you can do is to actually DIY, that is, do it yourself, an AI or large language model. And a year or two ago, that was kind of a crazy idea, but these days it's not as crazy as it sounds. It partly depends on what DIY means to you. So if you're going to start from scratch, the question is, can you get a sufficiently large set of trusted training materials? And can your organization gain access to the compute resources? So if you're going to try to build an entire LLM from scratch, that is, you're going to compete with ChatGPT, et cetera, that's going to be a real challenge. There's a lot of compute resources, GPUs, the graphic processing units, the things that are actually used to do a lot of this analysis. They're in short supply. They're really expensive. Getting access to them is again very expensive. GPT-3, one of the earlier versions of ChatGPT, is estimated to cost about $12 million in compute costs alone. So again, that's a massive investment for companies. So does that mean that you're basically stuck using just these open public facing things? Actually, no. There are cool hybrid approaches that are available now. There are some organizations like Hugging Face, which is an unusual name, but there's an organization called Hugging Face. They make these things called transformers. And so they've learned the language, they've learned how language works, they've learned how it all interacts and everything, and they understand how to ingest and provide information in a structured manner that meets the way most humans would want to interact with it. So you get these pre-trained models, but then you can actually use these things called transformers that will take your local information, and it trains the responses that are given are focused on the things that you actually then provide it. So again, my favorite use case for this is actually reading through your policies and procedures, which again are often in many different places. You have lots of different copies, and so if you can bring them all together and actually have the LLM trained up on your policies, now your employees don't have to read every policy. They can interact with them in a more dynamic way through that LLM, and they can actually ask it things like, "I'm a lawyer. What's the company's vacation policy for people in my role?" right? So now I can get that kind of basic stuff. Or Josh and I were talking before about what's my password, what's the company's password policy, or any of those kinds of interactions. Now, again, you have ways of actually making that much more accessible to people. And the beautiful thing is, if you're careful with the tools that you're using and the way that these things are structured, the likelihood of hallucinations is lower. And if the use case is reasonable, there are ways of, even if it hallucinates, even if it told me that I got 7 weeks of vacation, the likelihood of me using it all and not causing and not getting caught beforehand is really low. So you've got internal controls that can be put in place that even if there are hallucinations, you have ways of dealing with them. Um, Another thing to notice is that Microsoft has this new thing called Copilot and Azure AI. Those are tools that are built into, if you're a Microsoft 365 shop, these are tools that are built into your subscription. They actually are the interactions that you have with it are localized to your subscription, to your tenant in Microsoft. And so it trains up on your information and it gives you back the results from your information. And so again, the likelihood that it's going to inject something from the outside that's going to be a copyright violation or something like that is lower, depending on your use case, depending on exactly how you structure all of these things. So there are some ways to use these AI tools that can be beneficial to an organization. And we're seeing the market respond to the freak out from people. I'm not really taking credit, but people like me freaking out going, oh my God, there's so many issues with this. When you're using the public versions, we need a private version. Again, the market is responding. There are some very well structured tools that are designed more to keep your information private, but allow you to take advantage of these AI models. One of the other things that I alluded to before is on the billing side. So if you are in private practice, one of the fundamental questions that people have been asking is, although AI can make the lawyers more efficient, is it still ethical to bill the same rate for AI generated content? We know that many companies prefer to have their legal stuff on a flat fee basis, right? And so that flat fee is generally, there's a rough order of magnitude level of effort that goes into it, and you figure out what the cost per hour is, and then you come to some agreement as to how much that work is going to cost. And that's kind of the approach that's generally taken. Well, if you had these fee arrangements that were, $500,000 a year in legal fees, and all of a sudden the lawyer can pretty much just sit back, put their feet up on the desk, ask the AI engine a couple of questions, and it gets back results, and it's the lawyer sends that to the client, is it still fair to bill the client for the otherwise the 10 or 20 hours, or the equivalent of billing the client for the 10 or 20 hours of work that would have taken, that now is a couple keystrokes and a couple minutes? And so the ABA, the American Bar Association, came out with their formal opinion in 2024 as Formal Opinion 512. It says that if using a generative AI tool enables a lawyer to complete tasks much more quickly than without the tool, it may be unreasonable under Rule 1.5 for the lawyer to charge the same fee when using the tool as when not using it. So the ABA's position is basically, if you're using AI, you may need to reduce your rates when you're dealing with clients. Interestingly, Virginia took the opposite approach, which I actually kind of agree with the Virginia approach here. So in their legal ethics opinion 1901, which is still in draft form, but they have a proposed legal ethics opinion 1901, they say, and I apologize for reading all the content from the screen, but I actually think this one is really important. They say that while generative AI can dramatically reduce the time and labor required for certain tasks, such as drafting routine documents, conducting preliminary research, or analyzing large volumes of data, it would not be reasonable to conclude that a lawyer is ethically required to reduce or limit the fee based solely on that factor. Rather, the skill requisite to perform the legal service properly might actually increase, as effective AI use could require specialized knowledge to prompt, verify, supplement, and integrate AI outputs into competent legal work product. And that's the stuff that we've been talking about, right? It's great from an augmentation perspective, but now you have a different level of subject matter expertise. You have to know how to interact with these tools. You have to know how to process the information. You have to make sure that it is legitimate. And all of that takes work too. And so it continues the lawyer's judgment in determining when and how to apply or to deploy AI tools and the expertise needed to critically evaluate AI generated content represent valuable services for which the lawyer reasonably can be compensated. So if you're in Virginia, at least in theory, we're still waiting for Virginia to publish the final version of that proposed ethics opinion. But if you're a Virginia lawyer, know that you actually can, I'm going to use this term get away with, but you can get away with charging your clients for, even though you're using those AI tools, in part because Virginia expects that you will, for some of the other legal ethics requirements, that you will become competent with their use and become an expert in their use. And so you're basically just swapping one set of expertise for another. Okay, given my audio issues, Josh, I'm not sure what to do for the Q&A piece. That makes things very interesting for me, but we can try to figure something out. We do have about 5 minutes left, and I will also keep playing with my audio and see if I can get some sound back.
All right. Well, I can hear you, Jim. I'm not sure if you still cannot hear me, but I believe all the attendees can hear me. Haven't seen anyone say that they couldn't hear you throughout the training there, Jim. So our third and final password is model, capital MODEL. Because Jim is having some issues with hearing me, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the questions section, and then you can send them to me. I believe Jim might be able to hear me now.
I can, yes, I can. Woohoo!
Okay, perfect. Welcome back.
Thank you.
If you do have any questions, feel free to put it into the chat or you can email them directly to me. My email is joshpina at publiccontractinginstitute.com. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope you all have a great rest of the day. The final password's up there now, and that's model, capital MODEL. So, like Jim correctly guessed earlier, the first password led to the second password, which led to the third password. So hopefully we have that. If you do need any help with those password certificates, anything like that, again, please email me. Email me any follow-up questions you have. Or do have some that just popped on the chat there. Um, Someone said, would you say that AI is another word for robot?
Uh, in some ways, I mean, yes and no. So artificial intelligence and robots are not necessarily the same thing, right? Artificial intelligence is a way of training something. A robot is a mechanical device that moves around in a place and does something. AI can be used to control the robot, but they're kind of separate from each other.
All right, and then we have a thank you, great presentation in the chat. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us. Our final poll's up there now. That's just please rate this session excellent, very good, good, or fair. We look forward to seeing you all on future trainings. Jim, we did just have another question pop up, so I'm going to toggle over to that really quickly. For everyone else, you have all of your passwords. Thank you for answering this final poll here and for joining us today. This question is, can you limit the training ability of ChatGPT, particularly by utilizing temporary chat or changing it in the settings?
And I think that they say that you can limit the training, right? So and that's interesting. You'll want to be very careful, big picture, about whether I know you can disable the use of, from an individual user's perspective. Sorry, from an individual user's perspective, you can disable the feedback of your information into some of these LLMs, but it is something that has to be actively configured by you. And again, at a corporate level, trying to make sure that every one of your employees does that is a bit of a challenge. So you may be a subset, well trained, trusted, etc. employees, that's one thing. But if you're trying to do this whole hog for 1,000 person or 10,000 person company, the reality is that many people are going to either forget or just not make that setting change. So unless you can control it actively from a corporate perspective, you're better off finding a tool that does let you do that.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. And you're correct. That was a statement, not a question. So I did read that wrong there. If anyone else does have any questions, we have another minute or so. So feel free to ask that now. But of course, you can just email me. My email's in the chat. Jim's email is here on the final slide. So it should be on your screen right now. He also has a link to his calendar so you can book a meeting with him. If you don't write down his email here for some reason, you do have it available in the PDF of the slides that you have hopefully downloaded already. But you will get that in the post-session email from GoToWebinar as well. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Josh.